Welcome to this online lesson looking at the weapons and wounds in World War I. This is the first part of a three-part series. What sort of injuries did World War I weapons cause? The aims of this lesson are to know the weapons and wounds of World War I, to explain how different weapons affected soldiers in World War I, and to assess the dangers of World War I weapons. First, here's a do now task. How are the following likely to affect soldiers? Write at least one idea for each. Physical wounds, e.g. from being shot, mental trauma, or what was called at the time shell shock, and disease and illness. Pause the video while you answer those questions. Well, probably the most obvious wounds here are the physical wounds. Obviously, the trauma that causes to the body, physically, can kill you, often very quickly, often very painfully. Mental trauma was less well understood at the time, but is increasingly well understood now. This might come from months of stress and fear, or it might come from a single terrifying event. In either cases, this sort of trauma was just as possible to prevent a soldier from being an effective soldier and from being able to fight, even if it wasn't understood at the time. And yes, disease and illness remained a threat. Although control of this was much better in World War I than it had been say, in the Crimean War, it still was a massive danger, even if it's less obvious to us than the gore of shrapnel and bullets. Okay, when you're ready, let's move on. Let's consider the weapons of war first of all. In World War I, there were weapons of attack or offence and weapons of defence. Weapons of attack typically included rifles, like the magazine-loaded Lee Enfield rifle picture. Also bayonets, knives that fit onto the end of guns. Mills bombs, this is what today we would call a hand grenade. And the light machine guns, like the Lewis gun, also in the picture. On the other hand, we have defence. Rifles are also useful defensive weapons, providing accurate fire over long ranges. Sniper rifles too. Heavy machine guns, like the one pictured. Barbed wire to slow down attackers, or if not to slow them down, to funnel them into carefully chosen killing zones. And artillery, firing high explosive and shrapnel shells to tear people to pieces. Typically, defence in World War I outweighed attack, which made it difficult for either side to win. Both sides in World War I were dug into their trenches by the end of 1914 and were essentially evenly matched. Defensive weapons and technology, like those mentioned, had developed a lot further than offensive or attacking weapons. New technologies and tactics were developed to break the stalemate. More on that in another time, and in fact in one of my previous lessons you can have a look at the Battle of Cambrai for that. But in the situation of trench warfare, the only option was a frontal assault, attacking straight towards the enemy in full view. After all, the trenches went all the way from the coast in Belgium, right the way down to the Swiss border, so you could not get around the sides. The odds were generally stacked in the defender's favour in these circumstances. Firstly then, record the weapons in the diagram under the headings defensive and offensive attacking weapons. As a challenge, record them in order of strength based upon your personal view. Explain why trench warfare did not allow flanking attacks, in other words attacks from the rear or the side. Lastly, write a Peel paragraph explaining why neither side could break through the trenches. If you're unfamiliar with Peel, it stands for point, example, explain and link. So make a point about why neither side could break through, provide an example that demonstrates that, explain the effect of that, and then link it back to the question. Press play when you're ready to continue. Some of the more obvious wounds in World War I were caused by bullets and shrapnel. It's a gruesome thought, but you do need to consider what high-velocity bullets and shrapnel do to the human body. Wounds were rarely neat and tidy. Bullet wounds are referred to as GSWs in the army, gunshot wounds. World War I rifles were incredibly powerful, in fact more powerful than modern rifles, and the wounds they caused were terrible. The damage was caused in stages, as shown on this image of ballistics gel, a gel that replicates human flesh. It has been shot by a World War I style rifle bullet. Here's your task then. Describe the damage caused by a GSW, or gunshot wound. As an extension, explain how jagged shrapnel damage might be even worse. And you can see a comparison between a World War I bullet and World War I shrapnel in the images below. Pause the video while you do that. Done? Well, let's consider it. Firstly, you get an entrance wound or hole. This might be in fact quite small, as long as the bullet is not tumbling through the air and it goes in cleanly. That's the end of the good news. You then have blast damage to the tissues and bones as the bullet smacks into the soft flesh and possibly even explodes itself. And then you have an exit wound, sometimes. In fact, often it was better if you had an exit wound rather than not at all, as it meant that there was less likely to be an infection, and it would be less invasive to try and dig around inside the body trying to dig out the bullet. So an entrance wound, blast damage to tissue and bones, and then an exit wound. And that's without barely mentioning the risk of infection. Also, you might get lodged bullet fragments and dirt for an infection risk actually within the body as well. It might help you to create your own diagram demonstrating this. So if you want to do this, take a moment to do so now. Let's consider it a little bit further. Shrapnel could be even worse than bullets. Study source A. These are drawings from a World War I medical text. A bit of a warning, it's pretty gruesome. Explain why shrapnel wounds could be worse than bullet wounds. And then lastly, shrapnel travelled slower than bullets and took fragments of clothing into the wound. How did this make shrapnel worse? Here's our diagram then. We can see a comparison with a flesh wound, a bullet wound. The bullet tends to go in reasonably cleanly and possibly break and shatter as it passes through, leaving a small-ish exit hole. On the other hand, we can see that a large jagged piece of shrapnel tears through the flesh, shatters the bone entirely, and then blasts out the other side, taking lots of flesh with it. Look at the amount of the clothing and mud that's been taken inside as well. Okay, pause the video here and complete those tasks. So one reason that bullet wounds were less bad than shrapnel wounds is that bullets are by their nature smaller and more pointy, and therefore, although their wounds are not often clean or small, they are at least cleaner and smaller than shrapnel. Shrapnel being physically bigger, more jagged, less aerodynamic, is more likely to tear through the flesh. Also, look how the bone has been shattered. There is no saving that bone. You cannot reset it. You cannot put it in a splint. And at the time, there wouldn't have been the necessary technology to kind of graft the bone back together. A soldier with that type of wound would, if they weren't killed entirely, find that they would have to have that leg amputated. So shrapnel travels slower than bullets and takes fabrics of clothing into the wound. Why is that worse? Well, it massively increases the risk of infection on top of the physical trauma that it is causing as well. So let's have a look at the effects. Early in the war, men hit in the legs had only a 20% survival rate. These are the reasons: blood loss, damage to vital organs and shock, and infection. 41,000 men had limbs amputated. 60,000 men had facial injuries, even though steel helmets were introduced in 1916. Some men lost eyes, noses, even entire jaws. Here's another follow-up task. Summarise the number and type of wounds suffered from bullets and shrapnel. And as an extension, which reason why wounded men died from above, that's blood loss, damage to the vital organs and shock or infection, was most dangerous in your view. Pause the video now and explain your answers. Hopefully, rather than anything else, we can see just how dangerous such wounds were. They were often fatal. What was most dangerous then? Well, perhaps in the short term, probably blood loss. In the short term, that's going to kill you possibly within minutes. Damage to vital organs might do the same. Infection would be just as dangerous, if not more so, though, even though the effects were less immediate. It's worth bearing in mind from your other studies that during the First World War, there were no effective antibiotic medicines. So if you got an infection, your body either was able to fend it off or it killed you. We're now going to consider the weapons of war. Read the information on the main weapon types, and for each, firstly describe the weapons and the wounds they caused. Explain why the weapon was so deadly, and then explain how these weapons were more deadly than earlier weapons. Firstly, bolt-action rifles. These weapons weren't especially new, although they were about 20 years old by this point, but they could fire up to 10 bullets before needing reloading in the case of the British Lee Enfield, pictured. Pointed bullets caused deeper wounds. They were also accurate, long-ranged, and deadly in trained hands. Perhaps the iconic weapon of World War I is the machine gun, like the Vickers medium machine guns shown here. These guns fired identically deadly bullets to the rifles. In fact, the bullets fired by the machine guns were the exact same ones as fired by the rifles, only just loaded in a different way. They could fire up to 600 bullets a minute, the equivalent of 100 rifles. They were deadly against attacking troops advancing in the open. And lastly, heavy artillery. These cannon were the biggest killers of the war. Yes, that's right. People often assume that machine guns were the biggest killers of the war. Not so, only in attacks. Artillery by far caused the most casualties. So the cannons were the biggest killers of the war, causing 1/2 of all casualties. They could fire high explosives or shrapnel, and I've demonstrated shrapnel on the right there. It's a canister shot that bursts open with ball bearings coming out, to shower hot metal on the trenches, miles away. Millions of shells were fired per battle, and bombardments lasted weeks and months, not just hours. Recoil mechanisms meant that they could fire more quickly without needing re-aiming, and an example of a recoil mechanism can be seen on the left there. The gun thrusts back, absorbing some of the recoil, and then the old shell casing can be taken out and a new one loaded quickly without having to wheel the gun forward again and get the range right. Alright, pause the video here and answer those 3 tasks for each of these 3 different weapons. So hopefully you've got your descriptions down. Now when it comes to the wounds, bolt-action rifles and machine guns cause pretty much the same wounds, except that a machine gun firing that much more might hit you more than once. Artillery, on the other hand, caused shrapnel damage, as we've described earlier. So how are these weapons more deadly than earlier weapons? Firstly, bolt-action rifles were more accurate than earlier weapons. They could be fired more quickly, more accurately, and at longer ranges. Machine guns had the similar advantages to the rifles, but added to that a huge rate of fire. Machine guns weren't always necessarily aimed within sight. They were simply laid down to give a carpet of fire over a particular area. Very difficult to get out the way of. Artillery had incredibly long range, blast damage, shrapnel, and could hit from a distance. They were also more accurate and more quick firing than earlier versions of this type of weapon. Let's embed this then. Review your notes so far. We're going to see if you can remember them. Firstly, and then cover up your notes before you answer these, describe 2 features of the weapons used on the Western Front. Describe why bullets and shrapnel injuries were so devastating. Thirdly, what new problems with wounds did doctors have to deal with in World War I? And lastly, which weapon caused the most devastating wounds in your view? Was it rifles, machine guns, or artillery? Then explain your choice, and if you have time, compare your choice to another type of weapon. Why is your choice more deadly? Pause the video now while you explain your answer. Done? Well, hopefully you've been able to review your notes and get 2 features of the weapons used on the Western Front, and you've been able to describe how the entrance wounds, blast damage, and exit wounds of both shrapnel and bullets cause such devastating damage. There are new problems because so many more of these new weapons are much more powerful and much more common than they had been before. So which weapon caused the most devastating wounds? Well, there probably is a right answer here, and that's probably artillery. Not only did it kill more people than any other weapon during the war, but this was the weapon that would cause shrapnel damage, which was so difficult to survive, even compared to devastating bullet damage. So if we were to compare shrapnel damage to another type of weapon, well, you could consider yourself reasonably unlucky if you got hit by a rifle bullet in most circumstances in World War I. But shrapnel was random and deadly, and you could often have no warning that it was coming for you. Indeed, my great-great-uncle in World War I was killed by shrapnel before he even got to the front line trenches. Such are the fates of war. On that note, that's the end of the lesson. I hope it's been useful to you. And if it has been, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more of the same. Thanks very much, and goodbye.